All right. It looks like we are live on YouTube. Um, Welcome everybody to the OpenJS Foundation's monthly AMA, where you have an opportunity to ask questions of some of our hosted projects. Today, we have the webhint team, and moderating today's AMA will be Rachel Weil. And so I will go ahead and pass it over to Rachel Weil.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome. Thanks so much for joining. So we're going to be talking about webhint today.
And
oh,
we're good.
Okay, good. We're going to be talking about webhint today. I'm going to be moderating the discussion. So I hear we have questions. We have a couple pre-submitted questions. We have the ability to ask questions live on YouTube. You can tweet at OpenJSF with your questions about webhint. So we're going to get started here in a minute with two contributors. Before we get started, I did want to just introduce myself. Again, my name is Rachel Weil. I'm a program manager for DevTools for Microsoft Edge. So I've been there for not quite a year yet, but it's been exciting, of course, because we just released our new Chromium-based browser. So it's been really fun for me to work in open source again, to collaborate out in the open with folks at Chrome and contributors on the Chromium project. And I think that dovetails really nicely with what we're going to be talking about today with webhint, which is all about making the web a great place to dev, regardless of what browser you choose. So that's a little bit about me. I wanted to give a chance for our two panelists to introduce themselves, Harold and Tony. And Harold, I'm going to start with you because I saw you go off mute first.
First, okay. Cool. Yeah, I'm Harold, the honorary member of the project, part of the Firefox side. I'm a product manager on Firefox DevTools, which includes automation and the front end of DevTools and a few other things. So generally the developer experience. So a big part of my job is thinking, how to make things better for developers. So collaborating here with webhint and thinking about how we extend these things into DevTools is part of my job. So, and it's been really fun. Over to Tony.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Tony Ross. I'm a software engineer on the developer tools for Microsoft Edge. I joined the project, a little over 2 years ago. And yeah, just really excited to kind of help build tools for developers, getting to do this out in the open and getting to collaborate not only with other people, but other projects to bring this experience together has probably been my favorite thing so far.
Great, excellent. Well, before we get looking at some of the community questions, I wanted to open with a couple of background questions just to sort of set the scene for folks who might not be aware of webhint or what it is. So first of all, I'm curious to know, how did webhint come about and what does it do exactly? Who wants to give the elevator pitch for what webhint is?
So I actually think Harold has the longest history with the project of anyone here, if I recall correctly. But I can totally feel this too to start. So my understanding of the history of webhint came out of, there was a project I think that had inspired trying to originate this for some of the work that had been done for online scanner for Internet Explorer. There was a modern IE, but that was very browser centric. And I know that Anton, who really helped get the project started, was interested in doing something that was broader reaching for web developers. And I think Harold, in conversations with you in particular, you helped encourage him to open that up and explore something that could be useful for web developers, regardless of which browser or browsers they were developing for. And I think the key problem that was looking to be solved with the project is this huge amount of knowledge and that's ever increasing in the web development that we do. You have so many different resources and there's so many new standards, new developments going on in browsers. You can't hardly keep up with it all, let alone the community-driven projects and frameworks that build on top of the core platform. And so trying to build the best web content that you can be a really daunting task. And having a project like webhint to kind of help set the guardrails and help keep you on the happy path, I think is really the core idea of what it's about.
Yeah, Harold, did you have anything you wanted to add to
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I always like to see other people trying to summarize it because it's such a broad-reaching project where developers, especially if they touch new code, but even more so when they touch older projects, really struggle with like, what can I remove? Like, what were the decisions behind this code? And that's where webhint really initially took on a lot of the legacy just from the web. Like, you can remove this meta tag, you can remove this, because like so much of that knowledge is kind of lost in nowhere, where it's just you don't really know what can be touched without like, or why things were added initially. So that's, I think, a big part of just being helpful to developers on what parts of the code don't do anything, which is something Firefox DevTools has more for CSS as well, which webhint does really nicely for HTML and other parts. So that's really something people appreciate. Like they try to understand like this massive code base and pointing at something like, you can move this, you can move this. Like, this is probably not something you need. This is something you can expand to support more browsers. So just like not having this knowledge of what works across all browsers and what shape in their head, but putting that into a tool makes it easier. And the other part is that it's set up in a way, thanks to a JS Foundation, that it can be expanded. So it doesn't try to be opinionated, telling you this is bad, this is good, this is in between, but it's just telling you that these might be the things you might want to consider if you want to clean up your code. And depending on your priorities, if you want to look at security, look at performance, trying to solve caching issues, then those can really point you into the right direction without telling you if that code needs to be like fixed now to be according to whatever thing you're trying to follow. So that's something where it's really interesting, where I'll be like building out this ecosystem of other recommendations people can add to it, and then people also putting up their own experience, like learning a thing. Oh, I should actually like follow this direction, and then being able to spread that within a team, within a company. This is a nice platform to do it as well.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's kind of taking that, that thing we do when we're developing for the web, where we have like a tab open on MDN, and we have one open on the WCAG standards, and we have one open on like some Stack Overflow post about how to take care of a certain problem, and all that like institutional knowledge that we have in our heads. This is about sort of like consolidating it into one, between like the hints that webhint provides, as well as the configurations, sort of a custom, that custom sort of recommendation experience. And yeah, it's definitely hard to keep up with the ever-changing web and all of the standards, new implementations, things get deprecated, it happens. So that's a great intro to the project. Thanks. I'm kind of curious actually how, Tony touched on this a little bit, but how the two of you came to be interested in working on webhint, and what sort of drew you to the project.
You want to go first, Sarah?
Yeah, and I'll designate the first responders, so folks can not have an unmuting war. Yeah, Harold, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think 2-3 years ago, probably Anton reached out. I think it was like Chrome Dev Summit time, so a lot of browser people were in town in Mountain View, California. So we're just kind of meeting up with different people, and Anton reached out with somebody from the JS Foundation as well, and they just want to kind of get to talk about like this project they had in mind, that they want to get into a JS Foundation to be a cross-browser project, so everybody can participate. So and to have this open platform for everybody to feedback into the project, and that's where we initially started. So I think it took like another half a year to actually get the project launched, and like another 2 years probably to the 1.0. So things take time. So that was the initial one, and that back then sounded already interesting, because I think I wasn't even working yet on DevTools officially. So that was just in my role as kind of keeping tabs on the web and see where we can collaborate more with people creating interesting things on the web. And that was already really an interesting space, because that was kind of evolving, where DevTools extension system, and then later on thinking more about how these extensions can integrate deeper within DevTools. That's kind of where it evolved into. So yeah, that's my.
Yeah, Tony, how about you?
Yeah, I've had a long history with the web, and specifically a stint working on solving compatibility problems with browsers in an earlier role at Microsoft. And so the kind of goal of the project really appealed to me because I'd seen all the different ways that just the most minor changes in the core browser platform could negatively impact web content, like good intentions, but unfortunate results. And some of that came from various different ways that sites had been developed over time, and the need for kind of helping show the best practices and not just go out and talk about them, because I think that's a lot of what had happened before. Is we'd hold talks about, oh yeah, you should do things this way because you avoid this particular problem if something changes in the future in the platform, or that makes things faster, or it makes things more secure. But being able to automate that really appeals to me, because now you're not putting the burden on developers to go read pages and pages and pages of documentation, but you're helping identify just the pieces that are relevant to what they're trying to do right now. And that's what really got me interested in the project.
Great. So actually, I wanted to kind of expand on a couple points that folks made here. So I know Harold mentioned DevTools extensions, and Tony, you mentioned automation. So we talked a little bit about the problems that webhint solves, but we haven't really talked about what exactly it is in terms of like the forms it takes. And in fact, there are quite a few like sort of entries in the webhint product suite. So Tony, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the webhint offerings are.
Yeah, and to give kind of the very quick summary of what the project is, you can think of it succinctly as a linter for the web, if you will. But it's a tool about helping you identify best practices in your code. Harold referenced earlier being not too opinionated with the webhint. And I think that the way I look at that is it's presenting opportunities for best practices. It's identifying opportunities in your code as opposed to telling you this is exactly how you have to do it. That's why it's configurable, so you can change things. Now, to provide that and to help make it useful, when we talk about like what offerings are actually involved, we're trying to integrate into an increasingly wide array of places. We've been looking at this with the project as part of hitting different parts of the developer lifecycle, whether you're writing code and developing, whether you're debugging it in a browser, or whether you've already deployed and you want to evaluate something that's in production. We want to be able to provide feedback at each part in that cycle. And so the offerings that webhint currently has kind of revolve around that. Now the earliest was kind of the online scanner that's still very useful and up there, where you can go to webhint.io, you can type in any public URL, and it'll just kick off a scan using webhint's web service and give you the results. But from that, I think we moved into Node. And so there is a hint package on NPM that you can get so that you can run it like any other linter against maybe a staging or local URL, or even raw files on your file system to get feedback that way. There's a Node API if you want to programmatically drive that, but there's also a command line interface that you can run. In the past year, we've branched out from that to expand into extensions into browser DevTools to really help more with that debugging side of the life cycle. And so in the fall, the project released DevTools extension for Chrome, the new Chromium-based Edge, and Firefox. So you can run the tool on any site that you can load in the browser in any of those three browsers. And then we've just announced, I think we technically got the package out a bit earlier, but we just announced the official V1 for an extension for Visual Studio Code, where we're trying to integrate in much earlier in the development cycle, because we all know that bugs are more expensive the later you discover them to actually resolve and fix. And so engaging while you're writing code is sort of the optimal place to find something. There's other places we're still expanding into as well. We think that being part of your test flow to help you hold the line on the qualities that you think are important in your own project is really important. So you can integrate webhint into your CI flow. We've got instructions on the website to do that with like Travis and Circle. And there's an early project we're working on that's not final yet for integrating with Azure pipelines, but the project's up there on GitHub.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited about the VS Code extension. I just wrote actually a blog post about it, or Tony and I collaborated on that, and it's up if you follow webhint on Twitter. webhint.io is the handle. You can find our blog post about that recent announcement as well as other webhint news. So small plug. Great. So I think the next question I was interested in asking, and I'll address this one to Harold, is what do you think are the most important problems that webhint solves? And that could be like for you personally or for the web dev community at large.
Yeah, I think just the general theme of building things for users. I think that's what often like we as tool builders, but also developers like have to like keep in mind as the goal, like the end user. So anything that helps sites to work better and for more users is helpful. So things that often fall through cracks, like is of course accessibility. So that's like the lowest bar, and accessibility even comes in a gradient of keyboard accessibility, color accessibility, readability. There's a lot of things that fall into this. So and that's something developers struggle with, like because it has so many aspects to it. So you can start small, you end up with screen readers, and it's not easy to test. So any help we can give developers is helpful, but it also feeds into performance. Like performance itself is an accessibility issue for some people, especially if you traveled on 2G. So just like if stuff doesn't load, if caching is broken, like there's so many things you can do wrong. And oftentimes when you do performance audits, it's not even main thread IO that's causing problems, just like bad caching, sending too much data, and that's easy to audit for, and those are really hard to fix because often like big architectural problems as well versus like just switching on a CDN. So yeah, it's everything kind of in support of building better user experiences, especially where fixes are hopefully just adding some tags here. It's not about like a broken product design, it's really the engineering aspects of it, which people often forget. And having the tools in place to hold up that bar, like once you fix those things, you don't want to regress them. So having those tools in place across your development pipeline, in your editor, in your automation, in your browser, so people can test it on development and production, like that's I think the biggest thing. So the setting expectations for user experience and having a tool to hold people accountable.
Yeah. Actually, you brought up a great point. I think one thing we haven't really talked about is like not only does webhint like provide developers with some guidance, but you talked about fixes. So I hope actually, Tony, if you want to take this one, maybe explain to folks like what webhint provides, not just in terms of like information or standards, but in terms of like actually helping developers be able to fix the issues that they encounter in the code base.
Sure. Yeah, I think, especially looking over the past year, one of the key things we've focused on with the project is trying to do a better job of getting you back to the line of code that's related to the hint or issue that's being reported. And so, and that also really heavily helps enable the VS Code extension in particular. But even when you're not working against the raw source code, if you're using webhint through the online scanner or through the browser extension, you're typically going to get pointed to a source file and a line and column information to help you kind of identify where the problem really is. If it's something to do with HTML, then the browser extension will help jump you to the correct element in the elements panel so that you can kind of explore it. In case that may have been dynamically generated, you can at least explore how it fits into the rest of the page and get you back to that point. And another thing I wanted to just plug real quick here too is the hints themselves aren't all just part of the project. Like with this, we're trying hard not to reinvent the wheel. And so there's lots of other open source projects that webhint incorporates to help provide valuable feedback. We're not trying to create one repository that's the de facto standard reference for everything. We're trying to bring together other good projects in the community. So for accessibility in particular, it uses the Axe core library. And like for security vulnerabilities, it integrates with Sneak. So there's a number, and gosh, really importantly, when we talk about like compatibility of browser support for different features, webhint uses MDN's backing data from the browser compat data repo, so that we can have an understanding of exactly which features and which properties are supported by different browsers and surface that feedback to you, so you're not having to go and check MDN yourself.
Well, you don't want to personally maintain the repository of all knowledge of development yourself.
That's the beauty of the community nature. And what's nice too is that when we find something new, I can go and I don't just contribute to webhint. I've made contributions to browser compat data where I find something that may be a bug or just hadn't been documented yet there. And so it's a great opportunity to kind of not only consume other projects, but reach into them and help improve them as well.
So this actually segues nicely into an advanced question that we have here, which is what makes webhint different from some other tools out there like Lighthouse and Axe? And Harold, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yes, many people try to come to that question, I think, and taking it apart and making it really easy to understand. So I think they both serve definitely a similar purpose. There's an auditing function of recommendations. Lighthouse has focused a lot on performance. A lot of people like open up mostly for performance, and it's good that they have other audits in there as well to make them visible. So, and then it has a bigger audience now outside of the browser, with being integrated into page speed insights and really driving these business metrics that Google wants people to optimize against. So I think that's a great like factor for, or a great like showcase of how a tool can kind of expand the audience even to for everybody to optimize against the same thing. So that's interesting. I think the biggest piece for me is the extensibility of webhint and how it initially really focused heavily on being across the development pipeline. So being able to hook into vscode to audit your CSS and HTML really on a code level, versus on this like loading a page in the browser and seeing like it all comes together. It's important as well. So you need like across every state, every piece of these components to build up eventually a website for the user. So that's what makes it I think the slight difference. But it does have like, I could foresee in the future maybe like it's like a Lighthouse webhint but combining both, because there's definitely a broad area of what people open it for. Like they want to know what they can improve in their project. But also it has been interesting for webhint, as Tony mentioned, like they have included initially like web compat data, which Lighthouse so far doesn't show, but they have a big repertoire of things. So there's definitely room for those things. But the last one is probably the opinionated aspect. Like there's a lot of kind of red and green within Lighthouse, like things to do wrong. So, but developers like to have a prioritized bucket list, but they also just want to get a general sense like where can I fix, where the low-hanging fruits, where like the bigger architectural problems. So having a full list displayed, I think is also helpful in many cases.
Yeah.
Cool. If you don't mind, I'll pile on to that a little bit more, just to add one of the key things that webhint doesn't do, that Lighthouse does, is it doesn't do a lot of metrics in terms of real-time measurement of your performance. The focus for webhint in performance in particular is, as I mentioned earlier, it's more about opportunities. It's finding like things where you haven't set cache headers correctly, or looking at the total bytes over the wire and looking at how that's most likely going to load over a 3G or worse network, but doing it in a way that's, I would say, deterministic, so that you tend to get consistent results when doing it.
Cool. So I have a question. I'm going to direct this one to you, Tony. What do you think is the most challenging, like interesting challenge in terms of working in the webhint code base? And as someone who's obviously a main contributor to the project, what are the things that you find like very fun or sort of interesting or challenging about contributing to webhint?
Yeah, I think the most challenging thing is the release process of actually getting updates out the door. But part of that is because the project is structured to be very loosely coupled between components to help make it easy for anyone to come in and contribute to just a small piece. Like you have a particular idea for a test you'd like to write to help give feedback to users. You can come in, you can make a new hint, and you can focus just on a isolated NPM package for that hint, as opposed to having to worry about the rest of the project. But for those of us that are working on more cross-cutting pieces, that means we have upwards of 80 packages that we actually end up touching when we need to go make cross-cutting changes. And we try to manage that by using a mono repo with Yarn. So that helps at least make it a little simpler than it would be if they were all independent Git repos. And the tooling, I can only imagine we'd have to write to help maintain that. But yeah, it's the most challenging thing, but it's also what I think provides a lot of benefit for new contributors. Mm-hmm. And that's really the key thing where those of us in the project want to focus, is we want to make it as easy as possible for anyone to come in and contribute.
Yeah, I'm curious, and maybe I don't know if this was all sort of decided by the time you joined the project, but I'm curious to know, like, if either of you have this experience of like, was that always the way webhint worked, or was that build process sort of an iterative, or like, was that iteratively decided upon, or like, I'm curious if the project tried one thing and didn't work out and you sort of like arrived at this, like the mono repo way of doing things.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with what was before, other than to say I know it wasn't always a mono repo. There was more of kind of an inbox approach to hints early on, and then later, as the architecture became more abstracted, those were broken out to be treated just like any other package that could be added to the project.
Got it. Cool. Well, I think I kind of want to talk a little bit about kind of what's new in webhint. So we talked a little bit about this. The browser extension went out of beta into V1, I think late last year. vscode extension followed soon after that. I was hoping maybe Harold or Tony, actually either of you, if you want to take this, what were some of the improvements that were made to webhint for these V1 releases? Like what was the sort of maybe key features or things that you felt like, oh, this is really ready to come out of beta. We're really ready to put this in front of a lot of users.
Go ahead, Harold.
Yeah, I think the what comes to mind is a lot of how data is presented, because there's a lot of insights thrown at you like that can help you, or it also distract from important issues. So some of the issues I found initially when trying it out was just like better grouping and better like compartmentalizing of data. So that was in the accessibility parts, so having those grouped, and then also in the commentability. Commentability is really hard because there's an aspect of like false positives. So it is a like best guess, like this property might not work across browsers, but it's really hard to know all the interdependencies between things. So it doesn't necessarily cause an issue when you open the browser that's not working, but it could. So so making those as actually as possible, I think that some work went into that as well, to reduce the number of false positives, to relook at the whole set. And that was also where webhint really led the way, because this was one of the first projects using MDN compat data for that purpose. So there was a lot of kind of additional infrastructure that had to be laid out to make this more useful, versus just like, I'm applying these very blunt rules against your CSS, and these are all the things that didn't work, versus like, okay, I'm actually looking at your whole CSS, every rule holistically within within a set where it's being applied. So that's the thing where webhint really did a lot of effort to make this 1.0 useful.
Yeah. Do you know, did the work with webhint using MDN compat data, did there actually have to be changes to MDN compat data in the way that like any changes to the API, or was there any sort of learning from that, since webhint was, like you said, one of the early consumers of that?
So MDN, the browser compat data repo, is actually predominantly it's a set of JSON. So it's really more of a data structure than having an API to query against it. And so that was part of the infrastructure that we built up to help consume it.
I see.
And we have since broken that out into its own package that's still under webhint so that it can be consumed separately. And we haven't recently been discussing this, but we have kind of an open question of whether this might be something that would make sense to be part of the browser compat data repo itself in the future. Right now, I don't know of any other project that's chosen to consume using this particular API other than webhint, but it is something that could be interesting. Specifically with getting to the browser extension being released, that was the first place we turned on providing feedback using the compatibility data as well. We kind of tested it out there before bringing it into the other places that webhint already ran. And it gave us a good opportunity to iterate on the UX in a lot of ways, like Harold was saying, both in terms of how we present the messages, so that, I mean, there's a lot of data packed in there about browsers and version numbers and how to present that in a succinct way that helps make sense to developers when you're telling them specifically not only what browsers that they're supporting might have a problem, but giving suggestions on, hey, if you added this vendor prefix or this alternate property, you would gain support for these other browsers that you're trying to target. So that's a very, that was a piece that we worked on there. And then, like Harold mentioned, with accessibility, because webhint consumes acts that had been treated as kind of one hint, and we, based on his feedback, broke that into a dozen or so categories that are based on the categories in the Axe core project, but to treat them as independent hints so you can focus on different areas like ARIA or keyboard accessibility or labeling, depending on what you want to focus on first.
Yep. And severity was part of those, the V1 changes as well, right?
It came after the browser extension V1, but before the V1 of the VS Code extension. And that was driven a lot by feedback where we would get into discussions on the relative importance of different hints. Because out of the box on webhint, prior to that point, there were hint severities per hint, but they were all by default the same. So you could customize all messages from a hint to be an error or a warning if you wanted. But out of the box, it was completely unopinionated, but it made everything kind of feel equally important. And so with the change, we reviewed all of the messages generated by webhint and kind of assigned severities or mapped severities where appropriate. Like Axe internally already had a number of severities, and so we mapped the accessibility messages to those to come up with a more useful default set to help developers understand the most important things most likely to work on first. It's still configurable. Anyone can still like downgrade an error to a warning if it's not as important for your project, but it makes it hopefully more useful out of the box.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll add for the VS Code extension too, since we're talking about things that are new. Previously, webhint had really been focused just on the core web technologies of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then of course looking at network headers and traffic. But when you talk about helping developers while they're writing code, you're not often writing directly in one of those technologies. You're typically using a transpiled language, be that TypeScript, or you've got JSX if you're using React, or TSX if you're using React with TypeScript. Your CSS could be actually less or Sass. And so we implemented preprocessors for those for webhint to help translate them in a way that hints themselves can still be authored predominantly to look at the DOM or to look at style structure or the JavaScript AST, even if the original source is coming from a transpiled language. So it kind of helps bridge that gap. You get more feedback in your editor, but contributors that are contributing hints to the project don't have to think about every single one of those transpiled languages as well.
Yeah, that's a really cool new feature. I'm super excited about that. Cool, cool. So I want to talk a little bit more and look through my list of questions, see if there's anything I missed. We were talking about before the chat started whether we felt like webhint should start a band because of all the instruments in the background here. I don't know if anyone has any comments on the future of the webhint band, but I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I think definitely the branding of webhint is strong with Nelly and really amazing stickers. So that's been always fun.
Yeah. Anyone watching who
narwhals, I mean,
Nelly, yeah, it writes itself really. Yeah, if you ever see any of us at conferences, or me in particular, I always travel with Nelly stickers. So our webhint mascot is a narwhal named Nelly, and we have quite a few cute stickers of Nelly hanging out with computers and globe trekking.
Yeah, when I wrote the blog post for Mozilla Hacks to talk about the webhint extension and the 1.0 release, I included like a big version of the Firefox sticker for webhint. I think that's what I got most comments on, not the article. So
well, that's the important things. So I'm curious to know, and I'll ask this to both of you. We'll start with Tony. What you see kind of in the future for webhint, parts of the project you'd like to develop more, new features, things like that. You don't have to look too far into the future, but just some things you're excited about up and coming with webhint.
So yeah, we were talking about helping developers actually fix code. And so one of the areas that we've been kind of laying the groundwork for in better understanding where an issue originates from is getting closer to considering auto fixing things, more like you would get with something like a tool like ESLint. Obviously, it's a bit more complex for the types of issues that we're trying to tackle because we don't always have a great understanding of exactly where things come from. So the closer we get to that, the closer we can move to bringing that together, especially when you're talking about running in the editor like VS Code. I think there's also opportunities for us to collaborate between the editing environment and when you're running one of our extensions elsewhere to try to bring that together. But to me, you're trying to save developers time, and that's time spent reading, and it's also time spent editing. If we can help make that more of an automatic process, it's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Harold, I wasn't sure. Did you have any thoughts on that as well? Upcoming features you're excited about, or things you're hoping to dive into in the code base?
I think I'm definitely interested in something I've been exploring for a bit is how can this be part of a default experience within DevTools. So looking at like run experiments to preload this into Firefox DevTools, because people have definitely been asking for an audit tooling, but also we have had a lot of good feedback on any in-context auditing that we've been doing for CSS that hasn't been applied, and Flexbox and Grid has been really helping people to make the right calls on why things aren't working or to get them work better. So it's a really good learning tool that should be exposed more in DevTools. So one part is like getting the panel just into DevTools for all users, so they don't have to discover it, don't have to find it somewhere else. But then the other piece, like also providing more extension hooks into DevTools that get it into the right place. Like you want to see the CSS and HTML audits within your inspector tab. You want to get the JavaScript related audits into the debugger tab and then the network tab. So they need to be able to not just link to those tabs if any information pops up. So that's where we still need to improve things. And so that's my focus right now for webhint, just to get more eyes on it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a question from chat. And this question is, have you considered the impact of code school students using this tool? Is this something that has been considered in terms of webhint as a teaching tool?
No, honestly, I don't think it's something we've explicitly discussed before, but it's a really good suggestion, because we're clearly trying to reach out to developers that don't already have all this knowledge baked into their head. And so it's got me thinking just right now about what are specific things we could potentially do to help improve our reach to that audience and help them feel like they can engage with the project. One thing I will mention that we've done before is we actually have collaborated with some code school students in using webhint as an opportunity for them to start contributing to open source. We did that over the past summer, and it was a really great experience. We had a few different folks come through and contribute hints and improvements and fixes throughout different parts of the project. And so in addition to the actual knowledge base that webhint provides, I think being something that we could probably put a little more thought into how we can make that available as a teaching tool. Contributing to the project itself, I think, is also a great learning experience.
And yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I feel like every time I use webhint, I'm learning something, right? Like, because I don't have all the knowledge in my head. But yeah, if you, for the person who asked that question, if you have any other ideas or thoughts about this, feel free to reach out on the webhint IO Twitter account, or find us, contact info on the website, things like that. I'd be super interested to hear more thoughts on that. So thanks for the question. So actually, kind of to springboard off of this topic, I was curious to hear from folks, and I'll start with you, Harold, how people who are new to webhint can get started, whether that's like contributing, sort of familiarizing themselves with the code base. What do you sort of recommend for someone who might be interested in getting started using webhint, but also potentially contributing to webhint?
Yeah, I think the monorepo helps to discover all the good first bugs. So that's often, like, that's the problem we have in other projects within Firefox. Like, we're spread out across GitHub and Mozilla Central, Mercurial. So there's a lot of places to find good first bugs. So but having it all in one repo, if finds the right, like, server side, front end, whatever people are interested in. I think a great place to start, probably the best, is the rules section. Just if you have ideas on how webhint can be more useful for you, if you found something that webhint should warn you about, that webhint could tell you about, like, hey, if you use this, be aware about there might be dragons, like just these kind of rules, then that's the best way to start, probably, because those directly will help developers, like, just get something in front of people that you care about, that help you, that can help others as well. So it's an easy way to share.
Awesome.
I'm sure
Tony, anything to add there?
Yeah, I was like, don't be shy. That's the biggest thing. We're really eager and happy to help. Like, if you have an idea but you don't have a clue how to actually make a rule for it, like, feel free to submit it on GitHub, and hopefully we can help you with ideas on how to build it and get you started that way. Because we like I said, we try to keep the process as optimized for new contributors. And so the other great thing is, if you find anything that's not clear, we're always welcoming improvements to documentation too. You don't have to start big. You can start small.
Yep. And I believe on the GitHub repo, there's also tags for, like, good first issue and things like that. So if folks want to browse through existing issues and look for those tags, that could be a good place to start as well.
Yeah, I'll throw on there too is I think when we talk about new hints in particular, there's probably a backlog of ideas there, some easier, some harder. But also I think just scouring like Twitter and stuff, we've had good ideas come in that we'll see people tweet about that we'll turn around and try to get logged, where often it starts with, I just spent 3 hours figuring out that it's this one line of code that's giving me grief. Mm-hmm. We've got some interesting hints, in particular in the pitfalls category, that kind of originated there. One of my favorites is a hint about creating SVG elements dynamically. So SVG is a little bit special in the web space, and we're used to using the DOM calling create element to get all of our buttons and divs and everything we need. But if you try to create element circle, it's not going to render a circle. It gives you technically an HTML element named circle. You have to use this alternate API called create element NS that you almost never touch unless you're trying to dynamically create SVG elements. And so that's an interesting, and the problem there is there's no error. It doesn't fail, it just doesn't work. And so you can lose a lot of time kind of digging through before you figure out what's going on. And I think that's a really cool category of things. Like if you've ever experienced that class of problem where it seems simple once you have the extra knowledge that you were missing, that knowledge is something that's great to try to automate.
Yeah. So I see another question here about the link to the repo. So if you go to GitHub/webhint, or github.com/webhintio, and then the hint repo, so github.com/webhintio/hint, that is the mono repo that we've been talking about. You'll see the webhint.io organization has a couple other repos that are outside of that, like for the website and things like that. But the main repo that we've been talking about is the hint repo inside of webhint.io. So please feel free to go check that out, take a look at issues, raise your own, crawl through the docs. We'd be absolutely happy to get feedback. Cool. I actually feel like I am just about out of questions from chat and pre-submit and some of my own just questions I wanted to ask the team. Does anyone else have anything they want to share or anything we didn't touch on that you want folks to know about webhint?
I think it's interesting. I think Rachel, you and I had discussed this before, kind of our own workflows for using webhint, kind of eating our own dog food, if you will. I'd love to share that both within the project and in my own personal usage. Within the project, we have it set up to automatically run as part of our CI process for both our website and the UI for the browser extension. So basically where we're generating any visual web content. And we're using, I think, the CLI for the website and then hooked into the Node API for testing the browser extension. So it's an interesting way to kind of eat our own dog food on that front. For my personal usage, I really enjoy the VS Code extension because I like catching the issues as early as possible. So it's the easiest one to just have on and I don't have to think about it. Every now and then I get a squiggly and I'm like, oh yeah, I wasn't thinking about that. So I should go and fix it.
Yeah, I agree. I love it. Like the VS Code extension, it's great. So if you, for folks who haven't used it, you get the sort of like red squiggly underlines. When you mouse over an issue, you get that sort of like IntelliSense-ish box that lets you know what's wrong. There's also like in VS Code, the problems pane will actually list out, just like any sort of linter you might be familiar with, the way that it integrates with VS Code. You can get a list of your problems. You could just like one by one check them off. So satisfying. Yeah, absolutely. Harold, did you have anything else that you wanted to add that we didn't get a chance to talk about in the questions?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see like how browsers build up the end compat data so it becomes more powerful. Like right now it's I think it's really complete for CSS. There's more that has to happen for JavaScript and HTML. So how that will then carry over and like feed into more aspects of code will be interesting to see, especially if there's more detail. And then MDN also taking on more of that knowledge that already webhint created and how this data can be used for audits, so other tools can hook into it. Like webhint is taking a lot of knowledge in from Axe and from Snike, so it's really great to have this ecosystem created around this intelligent data that will just be able to apply in different tools. So that's, I think, yeah, that's what I like to see, especially as it came up so strong in the MDN survey. There was a developer satisfaction survey that ran. A lot of people were involved, so it's run through the MDN governance model. So we have Buku involved, Google, Microsoft, Mozilla, Samsung, W3C. So a lot of people had input on what we should ask developers about. And a big part is like, how satisfied are you with development on the web, and what are the biggest pain points? And 4 out of the 5 pain points were about web compatibility and cross-browser testing. So people really want to, like, it's one pain point I imagine is just switching between browsers is hard. So, and knowing what to look for. So webhint being able to like be in more browsers and being able to tell you in one browser what might not work in another browser is really changing the paradigm of dev tools, which was already very kind of this one browser, this one version oriented, versus it can kind of break out of the box and be, I can tell you like this will not work in Safari and this might not work in, so people can open intently the right browser and look for it and then check, yes, it's actually working. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, I think that pretty much does it for our AMA. We're almost right at an hour. So I wanted to thank our panelists, Harold and Tony, for joining us, and definitely encourage folks who are watching to check out webhint.io. So the website is webhint.io and the GitHub repo is webhint.io. We're on Twitter at webhint.io. Just search for webhint.io. You'll probably find us. We'd love to have more folks try out the project. Let us know if there are new features that you want to see. Love to have new contributors as well. So thanks so much for joining us. I think that's going to do it for us.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you.